He invited his ex-wife to his wedding to humiliate her. By midnight, the bride would be gone, and the groom would no longer own the empire he had spent years bragging about. The cream-colored envelope arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon, resting alone in the center of Madeline Carter's kitchen counter like an unwelcome ghost from another life. Outside, droplets slid down the tall windows of her Boston townhouse, turning the city skyline into a watercolor blur of gray and silver. She stared at the envelope without touching it. Even from across the room, she recognized the elegant handwriting. Jason Holloway. For years had passed since the divorce, yet the sight of his name still carried the strange weight of an old scar. Not pain exactly, just memory, the kind that lingered quietly beneath the skin. Madeline set down her coffee mug and walked toward the counter. The scent of freshly brewed hazelnut coffee lingered in the air. She slipped one finger beneath the seal and unfolded the thick cardstock. The invitation was extravagant. Gold-embossed lettering, heavy paper, a luxury waterfront resort on the coast of Rhode Island. Crystal chandeliers, ocean views, an event designed to impress. Exactly the kind of wedding Jason would want. Her eyes drifted to the handwritten note tucked inside. Hope you've moved on. Looking forward to seeing you there. Jason. A slow smile appeared on her lips, though there was no humor behind it. 4 years later, and he was still performing, still turning every room into a stage, still needing an audience. The rain tapped softly against the glass as she lowered the invitation. Memories surfaced uninvited. Jason standing in expensive suits. Jason charming investors. Jason shaking hands beneath bright conference lights. Jason accepting awards while conveniently forgetting the person who had stayed awake beside him through every failed prototype, every rejected pitch, every impossible deadline. Back then, she had believed they were building something together. She had believed marriage meant partnership. She had believed loyalty mattered. The divorce had taught her otherwise. Her phone buzzed across the counter. The screen lit up with a familiar name. Richard Hayes. She answered immediately. Did you get it? He asked. Madeline glanced at the invitation. I did. Richard laughed quietly. I suppose we're all invited to the coronation. She walked toward the window. Beyond the rain, traffic lights glowed red and amber through the mist. He's making quite a spectacle of it. That's what Jason does. Richard paused. Are you going? For several seconds, she said nothing. For years ago, she would have thrown the invitation away. For years ago, she might have cried. For years ago, she still cared what Jason thought about her. But that woman no longer existed. Yes, she finally replied. I think I will. Richard's voice softened. You know what happens next week. Of course she knew. The date had been circled on her calendar for months. Years, really. The culmination of a legal battle that had begun long before anyone realized it existed. I know, she said. Then perhaps this wedding will be more interesting than he expects. After ending the call, she stood quietly in the fading afternoon light. Somewhere across the country, Jason was probably finalizing seating charts and selecting champagne brands. He believed this wedding was the beginning of his greatest victory. He had no idea it was standing directly in the path of a storm. 3 days later, sunlight poured across Narragansett Bay as luxury vehicles lined the entrance to the Seacliff Grand Resort. The property looked like something pulled from a magazine cover. White marble columns, endless lawns trimmed with military precision, elegant fountains catching sunlight like scattered diamonds. Guests arrived dressed in designer labels and polished smiles. Conversations drifted through the warm summer air. Success had gathered here to celebrate success. At least that was the illusion. When Madeline stepped from the black sedan, several heads turned immediately. Not because she wore the most expensive dress. She didn't. Not because she arrived with security or fanfare. She didn't. It was because confidence carried its own gravity. Her sapphire blue gown moved softly in the coastal breeze. Her blonde hair rested against her shoulders. She looked calm, entirely calm. The kind of calm people only find after surviving something that once threatened to destroy them. As she approached the entrance, whispers followed. Some recognized her instantly. Others remembered fragments of old headlines and corporate gossip. Jason's ex-wife. The one who disappeared. The one nobody talked about anymore. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers bathed everything in warm gold light. The room hummed with money, ambition, and carefully crafted appearances. Waiters moved silently between guests carrying silver trays filled with champagne. A string quartet played near towering windows overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Then she saw him, Jason Holloway, standing near the center of the room, smiling, laughing, surrounded by admirers. He looked exactly as she remembered. Impeccably tailored tuxedo, perfect posture, the confidence of a man convinced he controlled every outcome. Beside him stood Olivia Grant, his bride-to-be, radiant beneath the ballroom lights. Jason's eyes swept across the room casually. Then they found her. For the briefest moment, his smile faltered. Just for a second. Then it returned, wider than before. Victorious, he began walking toward her. Around them, conversations softened. People sensed a story unfolding. Jason stopped a few feet away. "Madeline," he said warmly. "You came." She met his gaze. Calm, steady, unshaken. "You invited me." The smile on his face widened. He thought he was welcoming a defeated chapter from his past. He thought he had already won. What Jason Holloway didn't know was that before the wedding night ended, everything he believed belonged to him would begin slipping through his fingers. Jason's smile remained firmly in place as he guided Madeline deeper into the ballroom. But there was something slightly strained beneath the polished confidence. Perhaps only someone who had once known him as intimately as she could see it. The room sparkled with carefully curated perfection. Crystal glasses reflected golden light. Waiters moved gracefully through clusters of investors, executives, attorneys, and socialites. Every conversation seemed wrapped in the language of success. Yet, beneath the surface, Madeline sensed something else. A current, invisible but growing stronger. Olivia approached them with effortless elegance. Her ivory dress shimmered beneath the chandeliers, and her smile appeared genuine. Unlike Jason, she did not seem interested in playing games. "Madeline," Olivia said warmly, "I am glad you came." "Thank you," Madeline replied. "Congratulations." Olivia reached for Jason's arm, and for a moment they looked exactly like the image displayed on the wedding website, the magazine-worthy couple beginning a perfect future. But images could be deceiving. Madeline knew that better than anyone. A nearby group of guests gathered around Jason as he launched into another story. His voice carried easily through the ballroom. Years earlier, that confidence had impressed her. Now it simply sounded rehearsed. "Everything I have today came from hard work," Jason announced proudly. "No shortcuts, no handouts, just persistence." Several guests nodded approvingly. Someone raised a champagne glass in agreement. Jason smiled broadly, accepting the admiration as naturally as breathing. Madeline lowered her eyes to her own glass. Hard work. The phrase lingered. She remembered nights spent in their tiny apartment nearly a decade ago. She remembered pages covered with designs, sketches, and business models spread across their kitchen table. She remembered being awake until 2 in the morning while Jason slept. She remembered believing they were partners. The string quartet shifted into a softer melody. Beyond the ballroom windows, the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly beneath the afternoon sun. Calm, beautiful, hiding powerful currents underneath. Much like tonight. Across the room, a familiar figure entered through the main doors. Richard Hayes. He wore a charcoal suit and carried himself with quiet authority. Unlike most of the guests, he seemed completely uninterested in impressing anyone. He simply entered, nodded politely to a few people, and took a seat near the back of the ballroom. Madeline noticed him immediately. So did Jason. Their eyes met for a brief second. Jason's expression tightened almost imperceptibly before recovering. "Excuse me for a moment," he told Olivia. He crossed the ballroom toward Richard with the practiced smile of a man accustomed to controlling every conversation. Madeline watched from a distance. Richard remained seated as Jason approached. That alone was unusual. Most people stood when greeting Jason. Richard did not. Their conversation lasted less than a minute. Jason spoke first. Richard listened. Then Richard said something short and simple. Jason's smile vanished. It returned a second later, but this time it looked forced. He nodded stiffly and walked away. Richard remained exactly where he was. Calm, patient, waiting. A knot formed somewhere deep inside Jason's carefully constructed evening. Madeline could see it from across the room. The reception continued. Speeches began. Guests laughed. Music filled the air. Yet subtle cracks started appearing in places few people noticed. Jason checked his phone repeatedly. At first it seemed harmless. Then it became frequent. Every few minutes his attention drifted toward the glowing screen. His responses grew shorter. His smile became thinner. During one conversation, the vibration of another call interrupted him. He silenced it immediately. A minute later, another notification appeared. Then another. Olivia noticed. "Everything okay?" she asked softly. "Perfect," Jason replied too quickly. "Just business." Olivia accepted the explanation, but uncertainty flickered behind her eyes. Across the ballroom, Richard remained seated, occasionally checking his watch. The calmness of his posture stood in stark contrast to Jason's growing restlessness. The sun slowly lowered outside, casting amber light across the water. Shadows lengthened through the ballroom. The atmosphere remained luxurious, but the energy had changed. Guests sensed it even if they could not explain why. Conversations paused when Jason walked by. A few investors exchanged concerned glances. One executive quietly left the ballroom after receiving a phone call. Then another. Small departures. Small signs. Tiny fractures spreading through the evening. Madeline remained composed. She spoke politely when spoken to. She smiled when appropriate. She never mentioned the past. She never mentioned the lawsuit. She never mentioned the court ruling scheduled to become public within hours. Jason, meanwhile, seemed determined to prove his success one final time. During a toast, he stood before the crowd and lifted his champagne glass. "Tonight is about new beginnings," he declared. "About building a future with the people who matter most." Applause followed. Cameras flashed. Olivia smiled beside him. Yet as Jason lowered his glass, his phone vibrated again. This time he looked directly at the screen. The color drained from his face. Only slightly. Barely noticeable. But Madeline saw it. So did Richard. Jason immediately stepped away from the crowd and disappeared through a side door leading toward the private conference wing of the resort. The ballroom continued celebrating. The music continued playing. The ocean continued rolling quietly against the shore. But something had changed. The first domino had fallen. And for the first time all evening, Jason Holloway looked like a man who was no longer certain he understood the future waiting for him on the other side of that door. Jason remained inside the conference wing for nearly 15 minutes. Back in the ballroom, the celebration continued, but it no longer felt effortless. The atmosphere had shifted in subtle ways. Guests smiled, laughed, and sipped champagne, yet a growing uncertainty lingered beneath every conversation. The string quartet played beside the towering windows while sunset painted the Atlantic horizon in shades of orange and gold. Madeline stood near the terrace doors, watching the fading light dance across the water. She remembered another evening years ago when she and Jason had stood together overlooking Boston Harbor after securing their first major investor. Back then they had celebrated with cheap takeout and paper cups of coffee because they could not afford anything else. Jason had promised they would build something extraordinary together. For a long time, she had believed him. The sound of heels against marble pulled her attention back to the present. Olivia approached quietly. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Madeline nodded. "Of course." Olivia glanced toward the conference wing. Was Jason always this distracted? The question hung between them. Madeline studied her carefully. There was no hostility in Olivia's expression. Only concern. Genuine concern. "Jason has always been very focused on controlling outcomes," Madeline answered carefully. "When something unexpected happens, it bothers him." Olivia looked toward the closed hallway doors. "Something is definitely happening." Before Madeline could respond, the doors opened. Jason emerged. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. His tuxedo remained flawless. His posture remained upright. His smile had returned. Yet his eyes told a different story. The confidence that had filled the ballroom earlier now seemed forced, like an actor struggling to remember his lines. Several guests immediately approached him. Investors, executives, friends. Jason greeted them all with practiced charm, but his attention kept drifting toward his phone. Another message appeared, then another. Across the room, Richard Hayes slowly stood. For the first time all evening, he began moving through the crowd. A few people recognized him and exchanged curious glances. Richard was not a celebrity. He was not a socialite. But within legal and corporate circles, his reputation carried significant weight. Jason noticed him instantly. Their eyes met again. This time neither man smiled. The ballroom coordinator stepped onto a small stage near the center of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced cheerfully, In just a few moments, we will begin preparations for tonight's ceremony. Applause followed. Guests gathered closer together. Glasses were refilled. Cameras flashed. The evening seemed ready to resume its carefully planned schedule. Then Jason's phone rang again. The sound was barely audible above the music, yet the effect was immediate. He answered without hesitation. "What do you mean finalized?" Several nearby guests turned discreetly away, pretending not to listen. Jason's voice dropped lower. "That is impossible." His face became pale beneath the warm chandelier light. "No, do not send anything until I review it personally." He ended the call. Abruptly, Olivia was standing beside him now. "Jason?" she asked softly. He forced a smile. "Everything is fine." But the words sounded hollow. Another notification appeared. Then another. Then another. His phone seemed determined to deliver news faster than he could process it. Across the ballroom, Richard checked his watch. The time had finally arrived. Exactly 6:37 in the evening. At that precise moment, somewhere hundreds of miles away, a judge's ruling officially entered the public record. Years of legal proceedings. Thousands of pages of evidence. Endless months of depositions, reviews, and investigations. All concluding with a decision that could no longer be delayed. Madeline felt her own phone vibrate quietly inside her evening bag. She did not need to look. She already knew what the message said. Richard approached her calmly. "It is done," he said. She exhaled slowly. For years of patience. For years of rebuilding. For years of silence. All leading here. Around them, the ballroom remained unaware. The ocean beyond the windows shimmered beneath the last light of day. Guests continued laughing. Waiters continued serving champagne. Yet the foundation beneath Jason's world had already begun shifting. He simply had not realized how completely. Across the room, another executive suddenly approached him. Then another. Their expressions were serious. Concerned. Questions were being asked now. Questions Jason could not easily answer. Olivia watched the exchange unfold. The uncertainty in her eyes deepened. She had arrived expecting a wedding. Instead, she was witnessing the beginning of something she could not yet understand. Richard glanced toward Jason before returning his attention to Madeline. The public filings should start circulating within the hour. Madeline nodded. She felt no triumph, no excitement, only a strange sense of peace, like setting down a burden she had carried for far too long. The sky outside darkened. The first stars appeared above the Atlantic. Inside the ballroom, Jason stood surrounded by people, yet somehow looked completely alone. For the first time since Madeline had arrived, he no longer appeared like a man celebrating the future. He looked like a man desperately trying to hold on to the present before it slipped away. The first public article appeared at 6:43. It spread through financial news feeds faster than anyone inside the ballroom could have anticipated. Phones began lighting up across the room almost simultaneously. Executives glanced down at their screens. Investors frowned. A few guests quietly stepped away from conversations to make private calls. The ripple moved through the crowd with growing speed. Jason felt it before he fully understood it. He could see it in people's faces. The subtle shift. The curiosity. The concern. The questions. One of his board members approached, carrying his phone in one hand. "Jason, have you seen this?" he asked quietly. Jason took the device. His eyes scanned the headline. For a moment, he stopped breathing. The article referenced years of disputed intellectual property ownership, internal company records, newly released court findings. The ruling confirmed that several foundational patents connected to the company's earliest products had been improperly transferred during its formation. The rights now legally reverted to their original creator, Madeline Carter. Jason read the paragraph twice. Then a third time. The words refused to change. Around him, the ballroom suddenly felt warmer. The air seemed heavier. "This is not possible," he muttered. The case was not supposed to close until next month. Apparently, the final ruling was accelerated, the board member replied. Jason immediately opened another message. Then another. Legal counsel. Investors. Advisors. Every notification carried the same tone. Urgent. Serious. Unavoidable. Across the room, Madeline stood near the windows overlooking the dark ocean. The reflection of the chandeliers shimmered across the glass behind her. She looked composed, peaceful even, as though none of this surprised her. Perhaps because it did not. Olivia approached Jason slowly. "What is happening?" she asked. Jason forced a smile that lasted less than a second. Nothing that cannot be handled. But Olivia was not convinced. The confidence she had admired all evening seemed to be slipping away piece by piece. Nearby guests had started whispering openly now. Several were reading the same article. Others were refreshing news feeds as additional reports appeared. Each publication revealed another detail, another document, another finding. Years earlier, when the company had been struggling to survive, Madeline's research, designs, and technical concepts had formed the backbone of several critical products. The court had determined that her ownership claims were valid, legally enforceable, retroactively significant, which meant the consequences extended far beyond recognition. They affected control, revenue, equity, licensing agreements, everything. Jason's chief financial officer arrived moments later. His expression alone was enough to confirm the seriousness of the situation. "We need to talk privately," he said. "Now." Jason followed him toward the conference wing again. This time several senior executives joined them. The doors closed behind the group. Silence settled over the ballroom. The guests pretended not to notice. No one succeeded. Conversations became fragmented, uncertain. Olivia stood alone near the stage where the ceremony was supposed to begin. Her hands remained folded calmly in front of her, but confusion filled her eyes. Richard Hayes slowly approached her. "Miss Grant," he said politely. Olivia turned toward him. "You knew this was coming." It was not a question. Richard considered his answer carefully. "I knew a legal matter was reaching its conclusion." Olivia looked toward the closed conference doors. "And Jason?" Richard remained silent for several seconds. "Jason has known about the litigation for years." The words landed heavily. Olivia lowered her gaze. A long, uncomfortable realization seemed to settle over her shoulders. Not because of the ruling itself, but because of what it suggested. Secrets, omissions, half-truths. The foundation of trust suddenly felt less certain than it had only an hour earlier. Inside the conference room, voices rose and fell behind closed doors. Financial projections were reviewed. Emergency scenarios discussed. Calls placed. Calculations repeated. Yet every path appeared to lead toward the same conclusion. The ruling could not be ignored. The ownership structure of the company would need to change. Investors would react. Markets would react. Partners would react. Control itself had become uncertain. When Jason finally emerged nearly 30 minutes later, he looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. Like a man carrying a weight he could no longer hide. The ballroom felt noticeably quieter. He immediately searched the crowd until his eyes found Madeline. She remained exactly where she had been before. Calm, steady, unmoved. Their gazes locked across the room. Years ago, he had looked at her and seen someone whose contributions could remain invisible forever. Tonight, for the first time, he appeared to understand how profoundly mistaken that belief had been. And as another wave of notifications illuminated screens throughout the ballroom, Jason realized the story was no longer under his control. The silence that followed felt heavier than any speech Jason could have given. Guests continued checking their phones. Some attempted to return to conversations, but the illusion of a perfect evening had fractured beyond repair. The ballroom still glowed beneath crystal chandeliers. Champagne still flowed. The ocean still rolled quietly beyond the windows. Yet everything felt different now. The story everyone had arrived expecting was no longer the story unfolding before them. Jason crossed the ballroom with measured steps and stopped several feet from Madeline. Neither spoke immediately. Around them, guests pretended not to watch while paying attention to nothing else. 4 years of history stood between them. 4 years of unanswered questions. 4 years of silence. Jason finally broke it. "You knew?" His voice remained calm, though the strain beneath it was impossible to miss. Madeline met his gaze. "I knew the ruling was coming. And you still came. You invited me." The simple answer landed harder than any accusation. Jason looked away briefly. The confidence that once defined him seemed increasingly difficult to maintain. "You could have warned me." Madeline studied him carefully. For a moment, she saw traces of the man she had once loved. The young entrepreneur who dreamed big. The partner who had once celebrated victories with pizza boxes stacked on a tiny apartment table. But those memories felt distant now, like photographs faded by sunlight. "I spent years warning you," she said quietly. "You just chose not to listen." Jason said nothing. Nearby, Olivia watched the exchange unfold. Every new detail seemed to pull another thread from the life she thought she understood. She approached slowly. "Is it true?" she asked. Neither of them needed clarification. Jason hesitated. That hesitation alone provided the answer. Olivia lowered her eyes. The ballroom suddenly felt very large, very public, very difficult to escape. "How much did you know?" she asked. Jason opened his mouth, but struggled to find words. Legal complexities, corporate disputes, ownership structures. None of those explanations addressed the deeper question hidden beneath hers. Trust, honesty, transparency. Olivia took a slow breath. "I asked you about this lawsuit months ago." Jason looked toward her. "It was complicated." "No," Olivia replied softly. "It was important." The distinction hung heavily in the air. Several guests quietly looked away. Others remained frozen in place. The evening's carefully planned schedule had completely unraveled. The ceremony had not started. The speeches had stopped. Even the musicians seemed uncertain whether they should continue playing. Richard Hayes approached the small stage near the center of the ballroom. He had no intention of making an announcement, yet his presence alone seemed to draw attention. People recognized him now. They understood his connection to the unfolding story. One investor excused himself and left. Then another. Within minutes, a steady stream of departures began. Not dramatic, not loud, simply practical. Business leaders understood risk. And tonight risk was suddenly attached to Jason Holloway's name. Jason noticed. Of course he noticed. Every departing guest represented another relationship becoming uncertain. Another ally reconsidering the future. Another door quietly closing. His phone continued vibrating. Calls, messages, questions, demands, explanations. The endless machinery of consequence had finally started moving. Madeline watched it happen without satisfaction. Surprisingly, she felt no desire to celebrate. The court ruling had never been about revenge. It had been about recognition, about truth, about finally reclaiming something that should never have been taken in the first place. The distinction mattered to her even if few others understood it. Olivia removed the engagement ring from her finger and held it in her palm. She stared at it for several seconds. Not with anger, not with bitterness, only disappointment. The quiet kind that hurts the most. Jason's expression shifted. "Olivia." She gently closed his hand around the ring. "I think you need to figure out who you are when nobody is applauding." Tears did not fall. Voices did not rise. There was only silence. Honest silence. Olivia turned and walked toward the ballroom exit. Several guests stepped aside to make room for her. No one tried to stop her. Jason remained standing exactly where she left him, alone beneath the golden light. Across the room, the ocean reflected the first glow of moonlight. Madeline picked up her evening bag. Richard approached her side. "Ready?" he asked. She looked once more toward Jason, the man who had spent years building an empire around a version of the story that placed him at the center of everything. Tonight that story had finally changed. Not because she destroyed it, because the truth arrived. "Yes," she answered. Together they walked toward the doors. Behind them, conversations continued in hushed tones. Guests departed. Phones continued ringing. News articles continued spreading. And standing alone in the center of a wedding that no longer felt like a celebration, Jason began to understand something he had spent years refusing to see. Success built on someone else's contribution can survive for a while, sometimes even for years. But eventually the truth catches up. And when it does, it rarely arrives with noise. It arrives quietly, like a tide returning to shore, taking back what belonged there all along. The night air carried the scent of salt water and summer grass as Madeline stepped outside the resort. Behind her, the grand ballroom still glowed against the darkness like a lantern floating above the shoreline. Laughter no longer spilled from the windows. Music no longer drifted across the property. The celebration that had been planned for months was dissolving hour by hour, replaced by uncertainty, questions, and consequences nobody could ignore. A cool breeze moved across Narragansett Bay, lifting a few strands of her hair. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. Not because she felt victorious, because she felt free. Richard walked beside her toward the stone pathway overlooking the water. Neither spoke immediately. Sometimes silence carried more meaning than conversation. The waves rolled steadily against the shoreline below. Constant, unhurried, unconcerned with human ambition. "How do you feel?" Richard finally asked. Madeline considered the question. For years ago, she would have answered differently. For years ago, she might have said relieved, vindicated, even angry. But standing beneath the moonlit sky, those emotions felt strangely distant. Tired, she admitted with a small smile. Richard laughed softly. That is probably the healthiest answer possible. They continued walking. The resort grounds stretched across several acres of carefully maintained gardens and terraces. Lanterns illuminated the pathways with warm golden light. Somewhere in the distance, a fountain trickled quietly. Everything appeared peaceful. Yet inside the ballroom, entire futures were being recalculated. Investors were reviewing exposure. Executives were discussing contingency plans. Journalists were publishing updates by the minute. And Jason Holloway was standing in the center of it all. Madeline glanced back once. Through the glass windows, she could still see figures moving inside. Shadows crossing beneath chandeliers. Small groups gathered around glowing phone screens. The image reminded her of another night years earlier. A tiny office. Flickering fluorescent lights. Endless spreadsheets spread across folding tables. She remembered sitting beside Jason long after midnight while they worked through impossible problems together. Those early years had not been glamorous. There had been no private jets, no luxury resorts, no magazine interviews, only determination, shared sacrifice, shared dreams. Back then, they had been a team. The memory surprised her, not because it hurt, because it did not. For years she had carried those memories like fragile glass, afraid to touch them. Tonight they felt different, softer somehow, like chapters from a completed book. They had happened, they had mattered, but they no longer controlled her. Her phone vibrated gently. A message appeared from one of her attorneys. The transfer process had officially begun. Additional filings were scheduled for the following week. Several investors had already requested meetings. She read the message once and slipped the phone back into her bag. Business could wait until tomorrow. Tonight was not about ownership. Tonight was about closure. Meanwhile, inside the resort, Jason stood alone on the empty terrace outside a private conference room. Most of the guests had already left. The board members who remained looked exhausted. Every new report seemed worse than the one before it. The company would survive. Experts agreed on that much. The products remained valuable. The market remained strong. But Jason's position inside that future was suddenly uncertain. For years he had believed control and success were the same thing. Tonight, he was learning otherwise. One of his oldest advisors stepped onto the terrace beside him. The older man had worked with him for nearly a decade. "You should get some rest," the advisor said. Jason stared toward the dark ocean. "Do you know what the worst part is?" The advisor waited. Jason exhaled slowly. She earned it. Every bit of it. The admission felt unfamiliar. Uncomfortable. Honest. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then the advisor nodded. "Maybe recognizing that is where you start." Back on the shoreline path, Madeline reached the parking area. A black sedan waited beneath a row of lanterns. Richard opened the rear door for her. Before getting inside, she looked toward the resort one final time. The building stood bright against the darkness, beautiful from a distance despite everything happening. Within it, strange how appearances worked. Strange how long they could survive before reality finally arrived. She thought about Olivia, about Jason, about herself. Life had scattered all three of them onto different paths. None of those paths had led where they expected, yet somehow that felt appropriate. Growth rarely followed a straight line. Madeline settled into the car. The door closed softly behind her. As the sedan pulled away from the resort, the lights gradually disappeared behind trees and winding roads. Ahead stretched an open highway beneath a clear summer sky. For years she had fought to reclaim her voice, her work, and her future. Tonight she left with all three. Not because someone gave them back, because they had always been hers. The following Monday morning arrived with clear skies over Boston and the kind of crisp sunlight that made the city seem newly polished. Madeline stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office overlooking the Charles River. The water shimmered beneath the early light while rowers cut steady paths across the surface. For the first time in years, she felt no need to brace herself before walking into work. No legal meetings. No court filings. No endless preparation. The battle that had quietly occupied so much of her life was finally over. Her assistant knocked softly before entering. "You have 3 investors waiting in the conference room and 2 more requesting meetings this afternoon." Madeline smiled. Looks like a busy day. Looks like people finally know your name, her assistant replied. After the door closed, Madeline allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The office around her was elegant but understated. Warm oak furniture, shelves lined with prototypes and framed patents. Fresh flowers near the reception area. Every detail reflected who she was rather than who someone else expected her to be. Years ago, she had hidden in the background while others accepted credit. Now there was nowhere left to hide. And surprisingly, she no longer wanted to. Across town, Jason sat alone inside a conference room that felt much larger than it had a week earlier. Several chairs remained empty. Some board members had joined remotely. Others had declined entirely. The atmosphere was professional but noticeably colder. A stack of reports sat in front of him. Market reactions, investor concerns, transition plans, public relations strategies. Every document pointed toward the same reality. The company would continue. The business itself remained strong. But Jason's influence over its future had changed dramatically. One board member adjusted his glasses before speaking. The recommendation is unanimous. Jason already knew what was coming. Go ahead. We believe stepping down as chief executive officer is in the company's best interest. The words landed with surprising calmness. Perhaps because he had already begun expecting them. The silence that followed stretched across the room. Years earlier, he would have fought, argued, negotiated. Today he simply nodded. Not because he agreed entirely. Because he understood. The consequences had finally reached their destination. Later that afternoon, Jason found himself walking through Boston Common. He had not visited the park in years. Office towers surrounded most of his adult life. Airports, boardrooms, conferences, endless schedules. Yet now he walked slowly beneath old trees while autumn leaves drifted across the pathways. People passed without recognizing him. For once, nobody asked for a meeting. Nobody requested a decision. Nobody needed anything. The quiet felt unfamiliar. A phone call interrupted his thoughts. Olivia. He hesitated before answering. Hello. Her voice remained calm. How are you? The question surprised him. Honestly. Jason looked toward a nearby pond reflecting the afternoon sky. I do not really know. Olivia was silent for a moment. Neither do I. There was no anger between them anymore. Only acceptance. Two people confronting a future neither had expected. I hope things get better for you, she said. Jason swallowed hard. You too. When the call ended, he stood alone beneath the trees. For years he had measured success through ownership, status, and control. Now those things felt strangely fragile. Temporary. Like decorations left behind after a celebration ends. Meanwhile, across the city, Madeline concluded her final meeting of the day. Investors had expressed confidence. Partners had offered opportunities. Journalists requested interviews. Yet the moment she looked forward to most arrived after business hours. She walked along the river as the sun began setting behind the skyline. The evening air carried the scent of water and fallen leaves. Runners moved along nearby paths. Sailboats drifted quietly in the distance. Life continued exactly as it always had. She stopped near a bench overlooking the river and sat down. The sky glowed gold, then orange, then deep crimson. Beautiful transformations occurring without announcement, without permission, without applause. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. Jason Holloway announces resignation. She stared at the headline for several seconds before locking the screen. No celebration followed. No satisfaction. Only understanding. Some chapters ended loudly. Others ended with a simple statement and a signature. The river continued flowing westward beneath the fading sunlight. Madeline leaned back and watched the city lights begin appearing one by one. For years, she had believed reclaiming her work would be the finish line. Sitting there beside the water, she realized it was only the beginning. The future stretched before her like the river itself. Open, uncertain, entirely her own. 3 months passed with the quiet certainty of seasons changing. Boston surrendered its autumn colors and welcomed the first hints of winter. The city skyline glimmered beneath colder skies while holiday lights appeared along storefronts and brownstone windows. Life moved forward, carrying everyone with it whether they were ready or not. Madeline discovered that success felt very different when it belonged entirely to her. The media attention eventually faded. The headlines disappeared. The interviews slowed. What remained was the work itself. Every morning she arrived at her office before most of her staff. She reviewed proposals, met with engineers, and spent long hours developing ideas she had once been told were impossible. There was satisfaction in that routine, not because it was glamorous, because it was real. One snowy December morning, she stood in a research lab watching a team test a new technology platform built from concepts she had first sketched years ago. The prototype was not perfect. Few meaningful things ever were. But as she watched the screens come alive, she felt something she had not experienced in a very long time. Pride. Not borrowed pride. Not reflected glory. Her own. Later that afternoon, Richard Hayes joined her for coffee in a small cafe overlooking Beacon Street. Snowflakes drifted beyond the windows while pedestrians hurried past bundled in scarves and heavy coats. "You look happier," Richard observed. Madeline smiled. "I think I finally stopped looking backward." Richard stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "That is harder than most people realize." She nodded. For years, she had measured progress through recovery, through proving people wrong, through reclaiming what had been lost. Somewhere along the way, she had forgotten that healing was supposed to create space for something new, not just repair something old. Across the city, Jason was learning a different lesson. His resignation had become old news. New executives had stepped into leadership roles. The company continued operating without him. The realization had been difficult at first, then humbling, then strangely liberating. He rented a modest office several blocks from the waterfront and began consulting for small startup founders, young entrepreneurs, first-time dreamers, people standing exactly where he had once stood decades earlier. One afternoon, a nervous founder asked him how to build a successful company. Jason looked through the office window toward the harbor before answering. "Find the right people," he said, "and when they help build something valuable, make sure they receive the credit they deserve." The young entrepreneur laughed. "That sounds obvious." Jason managed a small smile. "You would be surprised. Some lessons arrived too late. Others arrived exactly when they were needed." On Christmas Eve, Boston received nearly 8 inches of fresh snow. The city transformed into a landscape of white rooftops and glowing street lamps. Madeline spent the evening at her parents' home outside the city. The house smelled of cinnamon, pine, and freshly baked cookies. Family conversations filled every room. Laughter echoed from the dining table. It was simple, ordinary, perfect. At one point, she stepped outside onto the back porch. Snow covered the yard in a smooth blanket of white. The night sky sparkled with stars. Her phone vibrated gently inside her coat pocket. A message. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. Then curiosity won. The sender's name appeared on the screen. Jason. The message was short. "Thank you for showing up that night." She stared at the words for several seconds. No explanations. No excuses. No requests. Just a sentence. Honest and uncomplicated. After a long pause, she typed a reply. "Take care of yourself, Jason." She sent it before she could overthink the decision. Then she slipped the phone away and looked toward the snow-covered trees beyond the yard. The world felt remarkably quiet. Somewhere in another part of the city, Jason read her message and smiled faintly. Not because it changed the past, because it acknowledged the future. Two people who had once shared a dream now walked separate paths. Neither path looked the way they once imagined. Yet both continued forward. And as snow continued falling softly across Boston, covering old footprints and creating new possibilities, Madeline realized something important. Closure was never a single moment. It was a series of choices. Small decisions made day after day. Choosing peace instead of bitterness. Choosing growth instead of regret. Choosing tomorrow instead of yesterday. And for the first time in many years, tomorrow looked beautiful. Spring arrived slowly, washing Boston in soft rain and pale sunlight. The snow disappeared from sidewalks. Trees along the Charles River filled with new leaves. Cafes moved tables outdoors again, and the city seemed to exhale after a long winter. Nearly 6 months had passed since the wedding that never became a marriage. Time had done what time always did. It softened sharp edges. It created distance. It turned headlines into memories. For Madeline, life had settled into a rhythm she had once thought impossible. Her company continued growing steadily. New partnerships formed. New products moved from concept to reality. Yet the greatest surprise was how little she cared about proving anything anymore. One Friday afternoon, she stood inside a renovated warehouse in Cambridge that now served as her company's newest development center. Engineers moved between workstations. Whiteboards overflowed with ideas. The building hummed with energy. Creative energy. Collaborative energy. The kind she remembered from the earliest days before ambition became tangled with ego. As she walked through the facility, employees greeted her warmly. Not because she owned the company, because they respected her. The difference mattered. Later that evening, she attended a charity fundraiser hosted at the Museum of Fine Arts. The event attracted entrepreneurs, researchers, investors, and civic leaders from across New England. Elegant conversations filled the galleries while guests moved beneath towering ceilings and centuries of artwork. Madeline wore a simple navy dress and arrived alone. She preferred it that way. Independence no longer felt lonely. It felt peaceful. She was speaking with a university researcher when a familiar voice stopped her mid-conversation. Madeline. She turned slowly. Jason stood several feet away. For a brief moment, neither moved. Neither seemed entirely certain what came next. He looked different. Not older exactly. Lighter. The sharp intensity that once dominated every room had softened. His suit remained tailored. His posture remained confident. But the restless need to impress seemed gone. Jason, she said politely. Good to see you. And surprisingly, she meant it. He smiled. You too. The researcher excused himself, leaving them alone beside a marble sculpture. Around them, guests continued mingling, unaware of the history, standing quietly between two people who had once built a life together. I almost did not come tonight, Jason admitted. Then I saw your company was sponsoring half the exhibits. Madeline laughed softly. Not quite half. Close enough. The conversation felt easier than either expected. There were no accusations. No resentment. No awkward attempts to rewrite history. Just two adults standing on the far side of a storm. How are things? She asked. Jason glanced around the gallery before answering. Different. Different can be good. I am starting to believe that. He told her about the startup founders he mentored, the small businesses he advised, the projects he found meaningful. None of them carried the prestige of his former position. Yet as he spoke, genuine enthusiasm returned to his voice. Madeline noticed immediately. You seem happier, she said. Jason laughed. That is exactly what Olivia told me 3 weeks ago. Madeline raised an eyebrow. You still talk? Occasionally. We ended things better than they began. The honesty made her smile. For years, every conversation with Jason had felt like a negotiation. Tonight felt different. Human. Real. A string quartet began playing somewhere across the museum. The music drifted through the gallery like sunlight through stained glass. Jason looked at a nearby painting for several moments before speaking again. I never properly thanked you. Madeline already knew what he meant. You do not owe me anything. Maybe not. But I owe the truth. He paused. Losing everything I thought mattered forced me to see what actually did. The words carried no self-pity. No performance. Just reflection. She nodded quietly. Sometimes growth looked exactly like that. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just honest. An announcement signaled the beginning of the evening's main presentation. Guests started moving toward the auditorium. Jason extended his hand. Friends. The question was simple. Careful. Respectful. Madeline looked at the hand for a second before shaking it. Friends. They walked toward the auditorium together before separating near the entrance. Different seats. Different lives. Different futures. As Madeline settled into her chair, she glanced across the room and caught Jason smiling at something another guest had said. For the first time in many years, she felt absolutely nothing painful when she looked at him. No anger. No regret. No sadness. Only gratitude for how far she had come. Outside, evening sunlight painted the city in shades of gold. Inside, surrounded by music, conversation, and possibility, Madeline realized the most remarkable part of her journey was not what she had regained. It was what she had released. And in that quiet freedom, she finally discovered the life she had been searching for all along. Summer returned to Boston with long evenings and warm golden light stretching across the harbor. Nearly a year had passed since the night that changed everything. The city moved with its usual rhythm. Ferries crossed the water. Street musicians filled public squares with music. Restaurants opened their windows to the evening air. Life continued forward, steady and indifferent to old heartbreaks. Madeline stood on the rooftop terrace of a newly completed innovation center overlooking the city skyline. The building represented the largest project her company had ever undertaken. Investors, university leaders, business owners, and journalists gathered around her, holding glasses of sparkling water and discussing the future. Below them, the Charles River reflected the setting sun like a ribbon of gold. A reporter approached with a microphone. "What would you say has been the biggest lesson of your journey?" The question might have surprised her a year ago. Now the answer came easily. That success means very little if it costs you your integrity. The reporter nodded thoughtfully. Around her, conversations resumed. Cameras flashed. Yet despite the attention, Madeline felt remarkably calm. She no longer measured her worth through public approval. Recognition was pleasant. Purpose mattered more. As the event continued, Richard Hayes joined her near the terrace railing. His silver hair caught the evening light while he surveyed the crowd. "You built something impressive," he said. Madeline smiled. "We built it." Richard laughed softly. "You always did understand the difference." They watched the city in comfortable silence. Then Richard handed her a small envelope. "This arrived at my office yesterday." She looked at him curiously before opening it. Inside was a handwritten note. The handwriting was familiar. "Jason." She unfolded the paper carefully. The message was brief. "Madeline, next month. Marks 1 year since that night. I spent a long time regretting what happened. Then I realized regret alone accomplishes nothing. Accountability does. Thank you for forcing me to face truths I should have faced years earlier. I hope life continues giving you everything you deserve. Jason." Madeline read the note twice. Then she folded it neatly and returned it to the envelope. No bitterness surfaced. No sadness. Only a quiet sense of completion. Across the city, Jason sat inside a small conference room mentoring 3 young entrepreneurs preparing to pitch investors. Whiteboards covered the walls. Coffee cups cluttered the table. The atmosphere reminded him of his earliest days in business. One founder nervously adjusted her presentation slides. "What if they do not believe in us?" she asked. Jason considered the question carefully. A year earlier, he might have answered differently. Back then, he would have spoken about strategy, persuasion, or confidence. Today, he chose honesty. "Then believe in yourselves first," he said. "Because investors are not the foundation. Character is." The founders exchanged thoughtful glances. Jason smiled. It felt good helping people avoid mistakes he had once made himself. Later that evening, after the meeting ended, he walked along the waterfront as sailboats drifted across Boston Harbor. The city lights reflected across the dark water. For the first time in decades, he felt no need to chase anything. No larger title. No bigger office. No greater recognition. The peace surprised him. Meanwhile, Madeline's event slowly came to an end. Guests departed. Staff began clearing tables. The rooftop grew quieter. She remained near the railing, watching twilight settle over the city. Her phone buzzed softly. A calendar reminder appeared. 1 year ago today, final court ruling. She stared at the notification for a moment before dismissing it. Strange. For months that date had felt monumental. Now it felt like any other day. Perhaps that was the final sign of healing. The moments that once defined you eventually become chapters rather than identities. Richard approached once more. "Ready to head home?" he asked. Madeline looked across the skyline one last time. The city glowed beneath the deepening blue of evening. Somewhere beyond those buildings, thousands of stories were unfolding. New beginnings. Unexpected endings. Second chances. Lessons learned too late and lessons learned just in time. She smiled. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." Together they walked toward the elevator. Behind her, the rooftop lights continued shining against the night sky. Ahead waited tomorrow. And unlike the woman who had opened that wedding invitation so long ago, Madeline stepped forward without fear, carrying nothing except the life she had chosen for herself. Another year passed. The city changed with the seasons, but some mornings still carried the same familiar glow that had greeted Madeline when she first began rebuilding her life. On a bright September morning, sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors of her office as she reviewed plans for a new educational initiative funded through her company. The program would provide grants and mentorship opportunities to young innovators who lacked the resources to pursue their ideas. It was the kind of project she once dreamed about when success felt distant and uncertain. Now it was becoming reality. The conference room gradually filled with advisors, educators, and community leaders. Their conversations blended into a steady hum of possibility. As Madeline listened to presentations and discussed partnerships, she noticed something that would have surprised her years ago. She was no longer motivated by proving anyone wrong. She was motivated by creating something right. That distinction changed everything. Later that afternoon, she visited a university campus where the first group of scholarship recipients would be announced. Students filled the auditorium with nervous excitement. Parents sat proudly in the audience. Professors exchanged hopeful smiles. The energy felt genuine, honest, the kind of optimism that could not be manufactured through marketing campaigns or polished speeches. As Madeline stepped onto the stage, applause filled the room. She looked across the crowd and remembered being young herself, carrying ideas that seemed larger than the opportunities available to her. She remembered doubting whether anyone would ever take her seriously. Standing there now, she understood how powerful encouragement could be. After the ceremony ended, a young engineering student approached her. "Thank you for creating this program," he said. "People like me do not usually get chances like this." Madeline smiled warmly. "Do not waste it." The student laughed. "I will not." As she walked back toward her car, his words stayed with her. Not because they praised her, because they reminded her why the journey had mattered. Success meant very little if it stopped with one person. Real success created opportunities for others. Meanwhile, across town, Jason sat inside a renovated warehouse that now housed a growing startup accelerator he had helped establish. The space buzzed with activity. Whiteboards covered entire walls. Teams collaborated around shared tables. New ideas filled every corner of the building. The project had started small, just a few founders seeking guidance. Over time, it grew into something larger, something meaningful. One entrepreneur approached Jason carrying a prototype. "Would you take a look at this?" she asked. He studied the design carefully. Several years earlier, he might have focused only on profitability. Now his first question was different. "Who helped build it?" The founder smiled. "My entire team." Jason nodded approvingly. "Then make sure everyone knows that." The lesson had become part of him, not because it sounded wise, because he had learned its importance the hard way. That evening, fate arranged something neither he nor Madeline expected. A civic innovation gala brought together business leaders, educators, entrepreneurs, and philanthropists from across New England. The event occupied a historic waterfront venue overlooking Boston Harbor. Glass walls reflected the evening lights while boats drifted quietly beyond the docks. Madeline arrived shortly before sunset. Jason arrived minutes later. When their eyes met across the room, both smiled instinctively. No tension remained. No unfinished business lingered between them. Only respect. They spoke briefly during the reception. They discussed community projects, educational programs, and future plans. Nothing about the past. The past no longer required discussion. At one point, an older businessman approached them. "I remember hearing about your story years ago," he said. "I never imagined I would see the two of you standing together like this." Jason glanced toward Madeline before answering. "Neither did we." The man laughed and moved on. Madeline looked out toward the harbor. The water reflected hundreds of lights dancing across the surface. "Life is strange," she said softly. Jason nodded. "Sometimes it gives you exactly what you need, just not in the way you expected." For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence watching the city skyline glow against the night sky. Around them, conversations continued. Music drifted through the venue. The future stretched ahead for both of them, separate yet equally promising. And somewhere beneath the lights of Boston Harbor, both finally understood that the most valuable thing either had gained was not success, wealth, recognition, or redemption. It was perspective, the kind that only arrives after everything changes. The years that followed brought a quiet kind of prosperity that never appeared on magazine covers, but proved far more valuable. Boston continued changing around them. New buildings rose along the skyline. Old businesses closed and new ones opened. Students graduated. Families grew. Seasons arrived and departed with steady reliability. Through it all, Madeline remained focused on the work that mattered most to her. One crisp October morning, she stood inside a newly completed learning center funded through her foundation. Sunlight poured through enormous windows, illuminating classrooms filled with technology, research equipment, and opportunities that had not existed there before. Young students moved through the halls with excitement in their eyes. Some came from neighborhoods where opportunities were scarce. Others were the first in their families to pursue careers in science and engineering. Watching them explore the facility filled Madeline with a sense of fulfillment no business victory had ever matched. During the opening ceremony, local leaders praised her accomplishments. Journalists asked questions. Cameras flashed. Yet the moment she remembered most happened afterward when a teenage girl approached carrying a notebook filled with sketches and ideas. "I want to invent things one day," the student said nervously. Madeline smiled and opened the notebook. Page after page revealed designs, calculations, and dreams waiting for a chance. She recognized something familiar immediately: ambition, curiosity, hope, the same qualities she once carried herself. "Keep going," Madeline said. "Do not let anyone convince you your ideas matter less than someone else's." The student nodded and smiled. Hours later, those words remained in Madeline's thoughts as she drove through the city beneath brilliant autumn leaves. Meanwhile, Jason's accelerator program had grown beyond anything he originally imagined. What began as mentorship for a handful of entrepreneurs had evolved into a respected network supporting hundreds of founders across New England. The irony never escaped him. He had spent years chasing influence through ownership, only to discover greater satisfaction through service. One afternoon, a successful founder invited Jason to tour a thriving company that had started inside his program. Employees filled bright workspaces. Products shipped to customers across the country. Opportunities multiplied. As the tour ended, the founder paused beside a large window overlooking downtown Boston. "You changed my life," he said. Jason shook his head. "You built this." The founder smiled. "Maybe, but you taught me how to build it the right way." For a moment, Jason said nothing. The compliment meant more than any award he had received during his corporate career. Not because it celebrated success, because it recognized character. Several weeks later, another civic event brought many familiar faces together. Community leaders, educators, entrepreneurs, and philanthropists gathered inside a historic library for an annual awards dinner honoring contributions to innovation and education. The grand reading hall glowed beneath chandeliers suspended from vaulted ceilings. Conversations echoed softly among shelves filled with generations of knowledge. Madeline arrived with members of her foundation team. Jason attended with several founders from his accelerator program. During the evening, both received recognition for their work. When Madeline's name was announced, the audience rose in applause. When Jason's followed later, the same audience responded with equal warmth. Neither recognition felt competitive. Neither diminished the other. Instead, the moment revealed something remarkable. Two people whose lives had once collided through disappointment and loss now stood as examples of growth, accountability, and resilience. After the ceremony concluded, guests gathered beneath the library's enormous stained glass windows. Madeline and Jason found themselves standing near the same display case containing rare historical manuscripts. "Funny, isn't it?" Jason said quietly. "A few years ago, I thought losing everything was the end of my story." Madeline glanced around the room filled with students, mentors, educators, and innovators whose lives had been touched by their work. Sometimes the end of one story is the beginning of a better one. Jason smiled. "I think you are right." Outside, evening settled across Boston. Streetlights illuminated sidewalks lined with golden leaves. Inside the library, conversations continued beneath warm light and towering shelves. Looking around the room, Madeline felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Not for the success she achieved, not for the recognition she earned, but for the person she became after everything fell apart. Because in the end, the greatest victory was never reclaiming what had been taken. It was building a life so meaningful that the loss no longer defined her at all. Several years later, on a quiet spring evening, Boston glowed beneath a sky painted with soft shades of gold and blue. The city seemed suspended between daylight and darkness, between what had been and what was still becoming. Madeline stood alone on a pedestrian bridge overlooking the Charles River. Below her, the water moved steadily toward the harbor, carrying reflections of office towers, rowboats, and the fading sun. A gentle breeze stirred the air. Nearby, runners passed, cyclists crossed the bridge, and families strolled along the riverbank. Life unfolded in ordinary ways, beautiful ways, the kind that often go unnoticed until someone has lived long enough to understand their value. Earlier that afternoon, she had attended the dedication of a new innovation campus funded by her foundation. Hundreds of students would study there. Thousands would eventually pass through its classrooms and laboratories. Some would become engineers. Some would become entrepreneurs. Some would simply discover confidence they never knew they possessed. Watching the ribbon-cutting ceremony had filled her with a quiet pride. Not because her name appeared on the building, because opportunities would appear there, because doors would open, because futures would change. As the evening deepened, her phone buzzed gently. A message from Richard Hayes. "Congratulations. You built something that lasts." She smiled and typed a simple reply. "We all did." Then she slipped the phone back into her pocket. Across the city, Jason stood inside the accelerator center that had become his second home. Most of the staff had already left for the evening. Only a few lights remained on. Through the windows, the skyline shimmered against the darkening sky. Earlier that day, one of the founders he had mentored announced the sale of a successful company. Employees would receive life-changing bonuses. Families would benefit. New opportunities would emerge. The founder had publicly thanked Jason during the announcement. Years ago, recognition like that would have fueled his ego. Tonight, it simply made him grateful. He locked the office and stepped outside. The cool evening air carried the scent of rain from somewhere beyond the city. As he walked toward the waterfront, he thought about how different life had become. Not easier, not perfect, simply more honest. Along the river, lights reflected across the water like scattered stars. By coincidence, or perhaps by fate, Jason eventually arrived at the same bridge where Madeline stood. They noticed each other almost immediately. Both laughed softly at the improbability of it. "Looks like Boston is not big enough," Jason said as he approached. "Apparently not," Madeline replied. They stood beside the railing overlooking the river. Comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that only exists when nothing remains unresolved. Neither needed apologies anymore. Neither needed explanations. Tom had completed that work. After a few moments, Jason glanced across the water. "Do you ever think about that night?" Madeline knew exactly which night he meant. The wedding. The ballroom. The moment everything changed. She considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But not the way I used to." Jason nodded slowly. "Me neither." The river continued flowing beneath them. Constant. Unbothered. Moving forward exactly as it always had. "Funny thing is," Jason said, "I thought losing everything would destroy my life." Madeline smiled. "And instead," he looked toward the city lights, "it forced me to build a better one." She understood completely. The greatest turning points rarely looked like victories when they first arrived. Often they arrived disguised as endings. Disappointments. Losses. Yet somehow they created room for growth impossible to imagine beforehand. The sky darkened further. One by one, lights illuminated the buildings along the river. The city seemed alive with possibility. Madeline rested her hands lightly against the railing. For years she had believed justice meant getting back what had been taken. Eventually, she learned something more important. Justice was reclaiming herself, reclaiming her voice, reclaiming her future. Everything else was secondary. Jason checked the time and smiled. "I should get going." "Me too." They exchanged a final nod before turning towards separate paths. Neither looked back. Neither needed to. Ahead of them stretched different roads, different dreams, different tomorrows. Behind them remained a story that had shaped them both. Not because of how it began, because of how they chose to grow beyond it. Above the river, the last traces of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon. The water continued moving toward the sea. The city lights reflected across its surface. And somewhere within the quiet rhythm of that evening lived a simple truth. She never came for revenge. She came for closure. What she found instead was freedom.